So, hi everyone, thanks for joining today. This is our first of the series where we are going to discuss from experts and learn from them so that we can create very specific task here. We can create educational guidelines, educational resources and activities by listening to experts. And I have a feeling that sometimes we, like everyone, we are in our own group and we are exposed to our own, set of experts. And so this is another way where we can actually learn from experts from all over, and we can see how we can learn from their expertise. But also we need to keep in mind that we need to ask the right questions, because sometimes I feel that experts, especially when it's to do with the scientists, they come in with their assumptions and with their with their thinking that everyone will understand. And I feel that that's really something that if we keep asking, they are more than happy to share and they are more than happy to answer the questions. And so it is up to the education folks here to see how we can actually use all these materials. And so we will not let Sonal and Sandro go away soon, because we can ask them questions and make sure that we understand the context, because probably this is the only time we get to really get their full perspective on things. And we can then use the material. Of course, we'll be able to get an interaction again after we've created something to show. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to get a lot of insights from them on the context itself. So just a bit about Sonal and Sandro. They are both urban planners, and they are faculty at Columbia University, and have been working in the space of sustainability, I want to say urban planning, for a long time. And I think they're the right people to understand various different dimensions. And I have certainly gained a lot of knowledge from the way or their lens, which is quite new and fascinating for me. And I think it will be a remarkable journey for you. I can assure you that you will learn something new out of this presentation. And that's the goal, that everyone comes here, learns things. And then we have different groups here. Thor is in Belgium training teachers. We have Wiplo, who works in Pratham India, and so many different people who join, who are able to, wow, Abhilasha is joining also from Dubai. So this is great. She's a principal, and really amazing to see how we can all learn from each other. Nidhi is joining as well. So great. Wonderful. So let's, Sonal and Sandro, over to you on how we can learn from your perspective, and maybe if you can go a little bit slowly so that it all sinks in, and then we are ready to ask the questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Radhika, for getting this forum together. It is very exciting for us also to share our knowledge and our work with all of you. This presentation that we have put together is for a very broad set of audiences. So it's for folks like yourself who are dealing directly with education. It has been Sandro and my um, sort of understanding that it's very important to take this work and translate into education. And that's why the collaboration with Radhika. But it's also made for folks who are dealing with policy, the government officials, and also people who are working on the ground. So it's a very broad presentation, and it looks at the issue of water at a systemic level. We will try to go slow, but please raise your hands, and maybe Radhika, you can moderate and stop us if there is a question, and we can do that. You don't have to wait for your questions to the end of the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that it's be worth saying up front is that we are looking in particular at the phenomenon of growth of cities, and where cities encounter agricultural land. This moment of encounter and difference and potential conflict is particularly interesting because of the issues that it raises in terms of modernization and in terms of the transition that is going on in the city. Just as a quick note, we have done this work in relationship with the grant that we share with Radica as contributing as urban designers, and it is a grant, a small seed grant given by Columbia World Projects about a circular water economy for Bangalore peri-urban areas. So we have been doing various contacts and several initiatives and working with non-for-profit foundations and also with some CSRs. So we want to give credit to them. In fact, sometimes we use images that they have produced, and there are little credits on the lower right whenever that happens. We really hope that the outcome of this work can be folded in an educational program, and it is definitely one of the objectives, let alone the fact that as architects and urban designers, we're also committed to eventually have a conversation with the authorities and have potentially an impact maybe on a limited area of this incredible development that is going on in Bangalore. So I think that you can get going.
Yeah. All right. I hope you don't see any gray patches on your screen and you just see a clean screen. All right. Yeah. So we've titled this presentation Towards Watershed Urbanism. And what we will walk through is a case study of two cities, Bangalore and Ahmedabad, and we'll explain both the terms, watershed and urbanism. You know, all of our cities are facing the dual crisis of too much flooding and also the aquifers depleting. And when you really look at the issue of water crisis, it starts at the planning level. We have been planning our cities. Historically, cities were planned around water, and they had to be designed to water because we depend on water. But with modernization and modernist planning techniques, where we thought that we have captured nature and we can pipe water from thousands of kilometers away to our cities, we dropped all those aspects of designing for water. So we are going to dive a bit into the hydrological system of our cities and why our cities are flooding and also depleting their aquifers. So again, two case studies, very different. Bangalore is very topographical. It's on a plateau. It receives much more rainfall as compared to Ahmedabad, which is much more flatter. It's in a semi-arid zone. But you'll see that, both the cities, the traditional water management wisdom in both these cities follow sort of the same parameters. So focusing on Bangalore first, let's look at the topography and how the city is placed in that topography. Now, the monsoons in the Indian subcontinents are shaped by the Western Ghats and the Himalayas. And interestingly, within the Western Ghats, there is the Palakkad Gap, which sucks in the monsoon winds into the area over Bangalore. And that's why Bangalore receives a lot more rainfall compared to the surrounding area, which is sort of semi-arid. So it's an interesting phenomena which allows Bangalore to receive this rainfall. And Bangalore itself, the little circle-ish thing in the red, sits between two watersheds. What do we mean by watershed? A watershed is, let's say you take this Kaveri watershed, all the water that falls in that area will finally slope down to the Kaveri River. So all the water, it'll either go to the underground aquifer or the surface runoff will finally find its way to the Kaveri River. So that's what defines the Kaveri watershed. And on the other side is the Ponniyar or the Pennar River Basin or the watershed. And so Bangalore straddles these two watersheds. And here is a zoom in map of what that means. The snake line that you see is the ridge. So if you can see my hand, the snake line is the ridge, and then all the water that slopes on left side will go to the Kaveri River, and all the water that falls on the right will go to the Penna River. And you see in the topography of Bangalore is made out of these ridges and valleys. So you see the ridges where my cursor is, and then the valleys, and all the lakes are formed, all the lakes that you see in Bangalore, and the drainage channels are along the valley. They are basically collecting all the water as it falls, comes from the ridges down to the valley, eventually to the river. And there is Bangalore between these two watersheds.
So I will just give you a sense of the incredible growth that Bangalore has gone through in the past few years. Okay. You see here this little animation that shows the population growth in million as the city that used to be called the Garden City of India has gradually filled up. Now, the interesting thing is that there was a way of thinking about cities in the 19th century that was essentially radial, as if they would expand like an oil stain. And in that sense, a strategy of planning was to think about a ring of green spaces. And a ring of green spaces, you see in the little diagram on the left, would assume that there is a center, that there is a ring of green trying to compensate for the growth of the density in the middle, and eventually a bunch of satellite cities that would be the ones created within the what was called the agricultural land, as if it were to be a juxtaposition between the urban and the rural. Now, the situation has changed, and the diagram on the right side is the one that gives you a sense that, in fact, the city is now expanding beyond the reach of a supposed green boundary, and it tends to expand continuously towards the peri-urban areas. So peri-urban areas are precisely that area which is not a gap that allows to distinguish the city from the countryside, and within the countryside, satellite cities. The city that is outpacing its own capacity to absorb the growth.
Sorry.
Now, here you see the valleys of Bangalore, an example, where you see that there is one lake, the Jakur Lake, where some interesting things have been done in order to both purify and control the flow of water. There is here a wetland that has been constructed by carving out a portion of the lake, and there is behind it a sewage treatment plant that takes care mostly of the sort of cluster of residential building that have been built around it. So it seems as if this could be a way of taking care of the health of the lake. However, there are other inlets that come into this lake, and thus inlets, to begin with, the one coming from the other lake, which is upstream from that, carry in, contaminant water, as well as the ones that come in from the sides, from the other urbanized area, where contamination, in fact, forces to maintain this lake at great cost. By the way, just to say two words, these chains of lakes built within the valley were built by man. They are artificial lakes. They were lakes that were supposed to retain water as it would come down with a monsoon, hold it, allow for recharge of the aquifer, and eventually distribute it through sluices, control ways of releasing the water to the agricultural areas that were in the valley zones below that. So they are chains of lakes insofar as they are connected to each other, but each of them has this capacity of retaining water. Now,
Sorry. Wait, hold on. Next slide. Okay.
okay. So in the case of Bangalore, the big read that we was one of the areas that flooded indicates an area of growth where the airport is being located. Along this highway, the airport that was started to be designated as being for 12 million passengers is also expanding tremendously because Bangalore has, become the IT capital of India. And so the pressure on real estate has caused the filling up of all the areas within the city boundaries. And at this point, along this infrastructural lines is producing incredible development, both in terms of the IT companies, but also in terms of the population movement. So you see on the lower right a diagram that talks about the 2031 plan that acknowledges the fact that the city is expanding along these corridors. And this is probably the most active corridor in the whole sub-region where Bangalore sits.
So the structural plan that you see over here with these different growth corridors, C6 is a certain growth corridor, and there are other growth corridors along major highways. So let's talk a bit about what is the watershed system of Bangalore. And this set of slides was specifically put in response to a town planning officer who told us, the land is flat, but the land is absolutely not flat. What you see on the screen is one watershed. The red boundary is a boundary of the watershed that we have been focusing on, which is just south of the Bangalore International Airport. The red areas are the peak, and the yellow, green, and blue are then the depressions in the land. And here you can see this is an exaggerated topographical model, almost like looking at the ground with a microscope to understand how water really flows. The red is the watershed boundary. All the water coming, falling within that boundary is going to find its way through drains into lakes and then finally to the Penna River Basin. Now, as Sandro said before, the lakes are all man-made and they are formed by damming existing drains. And you see the drains follow exactly the depressions on the land. All of these are drainage channels that lead water, gather water from the land and to the lakes, and then connect the lakes from one to the other. The patch in the blue that you see on this diagram is what's called the valley zone, but it's also the area with the highest groundwater recharge potential. Okay, so when water falls and accumulates there, that's the area that has the highest potential to recharge our aquifers. But it's also then corresponding to the zone that floods the most. And so when you see in Bangalore city, the areas that flood, they correspond all to the valley zones. The yellow line over here is what is a sub-watershed. Within the bigger watershed, there are sub-watersheds, and each lake has its drainage channels, and then they have their catchment zones, which are then the micro watersheds. Now, focusing further into what a drainage channel really looks like, and we might all be familiar with over here in the US, there are creeks. In India, they're often called nalas. We've seen a lot of these sort of nalas converted into sewage drains. So this is how they exist in agricultural areas. Drainage channels, we think, carry water from point A to point B. That's sort of the common conception, that they are channels that carry water from point A to point B. But actually, drainage channels have a very, very important function, two important functions in a flood control, because it's a huge channel and it's taking water from around the land and then absorbing it. And the second function is of aquifer recharge. So what you see in this image over here is a percolation pit that this is work done with our friends at ITC. And these percolation pits fasten the rate of aquifer recharge. So, they build a check dam to slow the water and almost create these mini pools within the drainage channels. And then you have these percolation pits that allow the water to recharge the aquifer. So very interestingly, this very simple hydrological infrastructure has two important roles of flood control and aquifer recharge. And as cities get urbanized and agricultural land is getting converted into urban development, we know and we have seen that all of this wisdom of managing the land and water gets erased because we cover over the drainage channels or encroach it or at worst concretize it and convert them into sewage drains. So is it possible to counter that threat that this wisdom is going to be lost very, very soon in our peri-urban areas? Here you see what is already happening in the peri-urban areas. I'm going to pause over here. This is the same micro watershed area. And the pink lines is all the plotting that has already happened. So all of that agricultural land is already plotted for housing, for residential units and all of that. And the blue patch is the valley zone, the high flood risk zone. And you can see already over here and in a few other areas that there is plotting happen. Now, why does that plotting happen in flood risk zones? Because it's an area that does not have water throughout the year. But when it rains heavy, it is going to get flooded. And we know that. And traditionally, in the agricultural zone, the farmers knew that, they know that. And so they have a very different crop pattern in this area as opposed to the higher ground. Do you want to say something?
No, I think that what we have done at this point is to look at this condition, and as you see, that's the peri-urban condition. The agricultural land get to be sold. Different sizes of plots get to be laid out. It makes sense that they would start by doing it on the higher ground, but as Sonal pointed out, little by little, the real estate pressure will probably lead to obstruct the channels that feed the lakes and eventually to build in areas that are prone to flood. That's what has happened in the city of Bangalore. Within the municipal boundary, all this filling in, as you probably recall from that little animation of the growth of the city, has essentially obstructed the flow, and it has interfered with the areas that were able to absorb or receive excess water in the case of monsoon and overflow the lakes. So what we're trying to do as urban designers is to identify the moment in which this process is happening and to see what can be done in order to maintain what Sonal called earlier on, the wisdom of agricultural land. You might want to say 2 words here.
Yeah, so imagine, it's very clear to us that if you kill the drains, you've killed the hydrological system and you've killed the lakes, because the lakes do not exist and cannot exist without the drainage channels that collect the water and bring the water to the lakes. So if you think about it, when we look at lake rejuvenation project, you've probably never heard about the drainage channels in the lake rejuvenation project. So I think our focus here is to bring this understanding of watershed or catchment to the crisis of water in Bangalore and in many other cities. So, for example, what if these drainage channels, as land gets urbanized, are still preserved for their function of flood control and aquifer recharge? And what if they become the blue-green arteries of our cities, almost like sponge infrastructure, and we organize our green spaces around these drainage channels, so sort of protect them, to think of these as important highways, water highways, but very critical and important water highways for our cities.
So we wanted to test this thesis by looking at a portion of an area within what we just highlighted. And that's the question that Sonal formulated. What role can drainage channels and lakes play as agricultural land gets converted to urban development in the peri-urban areas? So in terms of this systemic approach, we picked a little rectangle, a little condition that you see here, and look at the potential that the drainage channel. Now, you see here, and you have seen it before, you see here traced in black, the outline of the plotting that is already happening. In some instances, it has entered what we ideally think as a buffer zone around the drainage channel, which could take on, in terms of public space, several positive functions. Public parks could become recreational complex in areas where there is the possibility of widening the space because of the control that could be done by governmental agencies, or because areas have not been appealing for development. In this case, they were quarries in that area. And so expand the sort of the area that sort of surrounds the drainage channel in order to make it the artery of a system of public space. There could be opportunities to use that in order to create other kind of public space that are more oriented towards sports and activities. But most importantly, in order to control the flood, what Sonal showed earlier, these check dams would basically replicate within the valley of each of these channels the kind of logic of the chain of lakes that was introduced at the scale of the region in order to control the flood and to recharge the aquifer. Now, the crisis of water is both, in the case of Bangalore, a crisis of flooding, but also because of the way in which these channels are often resolved like pipes in concrete, there is no recharge of the aquifer. So the city is also experiencing a very great crisis in terms of dependency from water because it has no river. So the aquifer, the capacity of the lakes, the capacity of this system of drainage channel to absorb water, to recharge the aquifer, is what then would allow the extraction through bore wells, which is something that has been done, very much so. Every apartment complex has one, if not more. And because the aquifer that used to be recharged through these systems has been depleted, now the bore wells go very, very, very deep through the underlying granite ground, which unfortunately tends to sort of charge the water with further, metal contaminants, which therefore makes the water not good as opposed to just filtered the way it used to be in the agricultural context. So we are saying when there are connections between these developments, let's make sure that there is no obstruction in the flow, that there are street bridges that allow so the continuation of this fascia of green space. And we could also eventually sometimes install within those public spaces educational centers. So there are many techniques at this point. We might not get into the specifics of nature-based solutions that would allow this wider margin to absorb water, to begin to filter it, to begin to treat it in order to purify, such that the water that would reach the lake would be actually a positive contribution to the health of the lake itself. So in the current urban planning, you see here the airport in gray. You see how the highway has been acting as a conduit for this hyperdevelopment. The yellow is residential, purple is industrial, red is institutional, and so forth. So the interesting thing is that planners tend to look at areas on paper as if they were flat. As if one could draw destinations of use, attribution of future functions, just by identifying areas that are calculated on the basis of the projected densities. So every square, every street that is traced within this master plan, A, does not acknowledge topography, if not very marginally. It does to the degree in which it acknowledges the fact that there is a valley that connects the lakes. But when it comes down to drainage channels, because of the logic of encroachments, it tends to be very vague. Let's go on and see that that is the area that we were looking at. You see that there is a marker of drainage channels in the land. But for example, the one on the left between the highway and the sample that we sort of talked about has already been encroached completely by hyperdevelopment. So it is, remember that this plan was formulated more than 20 years ago. And so a lot of stuff has happened since. And, you know, the attribution of residential areas just like that through sort of new roads that cut through the fields, as you can see, diagonally making quantities that have to do with the projection of people, you know, do not respect at all, you know, that is a tax map of a village. Actually, the master plan doesn't even mark the presence of the existing villages within this field of yellow. So it is pretty radically oblivious of a richness of the land as it was set up originally in agriculture. So if we think about that, and we can compare what we are trying to say and the focus on the potential of drainage channels to contribute to the health of the lakes, the valleys, and the areas surrounding them as public space, we can have a look at a sort of a larger context, which is the conditions of the drainage channels that have been mapped, again, by our friends at ITC, which is a CSR that contributes to a number of these interventions in support of agriculture. The one which is in red is the one that, as I said, has been compromised. The blue one, which is the one that we took care of, is still active. There are others that are partially encroached. There are others that are still in the process of being mapped. But within this context, you know, you understand that to keep count of the ones that could still be recovered, so to speak, or even the ones that have been partially encroached, that could be sort of brought back to contribute to public space, is an endeavor that we're trying to sort of promote at the level of general conversation and also education. What is your watershed is the basic question that it would be worth asking, but also at the level of administration and planning authorities.
Yeah, so this image is a snapshot in current time about if we don't act now, we are going to head to the same crisis that Bangalore city is facing. So all the orange ones are already compromised. And if all of these drainage channels turn to red, we are going to have the same issue of flooding and a depleting aquifer. So this is an image that tells us about the urgency of acting in the peri-urban area now before it is too late. Already it feels it's a little late. And so what does designing for water mean? And what we, in the next few slides, what we're going to share with you are very basic conceptual sketches. And it's basically, we asked ourselves the question, if we were to do an urban plan, a plan that converts agricultural zone into urban development, how would we do it? So the images that you're going to see next are acontextual, meaning it doesn't have a specific site, but it is designed to the general topographical logic of Bangalore. We know that Bangalore is a system of lakes, drainage channels, and ridges and valleys. The gray lines are the contour lines. The drainage channels are bringing water from higher ground to lower valley zones. And then all of these lakes are connected from one to the other through what is known as the Raja Kaluwe. So this is the basic framework and system of Bangalore. So the question we are asking is, what if we preserve the drainage channels and then convert them into linear wetlands that purify urban runoff? Because a lot of urban runoff is very polluted compared to agricultural runoff. You do have some contamination in agricultural runoff too. But what if we think about these drainage channels that are already infrastructure laid in the ground as wetlands that can clean the water using nature-based solutions as the water gets to the lakes?
But two words, I mean, think about the number of hard surfaces that development creates.
Right.
All the streets are hard surfaces. All the roofs are hard surfaces. There is an incredible amount of water that does not reach the ground. And on top of it, especially on the street, which is already contaminated because of the use of cars. So the idea that there is an incredible increase in the amount of water that runs off, the water runs off and runs down the streets, essentially, topographically towards the valleys where the channels were, puts an interesting pressure, but also opportunity in what one can do with those.
So then imagine organizing your roads along topography. So the roads respect topography as opposed to going against it. And once the road framework respects topography, you can have these urban blocks, your residential blocks that also will automatically respect topography. And so whatever water that falls on these roads can be directed towards the drainage channels, like these blue arrows point out. So the storm water drains, first of all, there will be shorter runs from your house to the drainage channel, and then the drainage channel purifies that water as it gets down to the valleys and the lakes. And then in the valley zone, one can have a sewage treatment plant. And when we put this series of sketches together, we were thinking of a sewage treatment plant for a neighborhood. But I think it makes sense to think of a sewage treatment plant for a microshed. So every microshed has a micro watershed has its sewage treatment plant. And that's not very different from what's happening in Bangalore. Bangalore has the highest number of sewage treatment plants, around 3,000 plus of them, but they are not organized based on watersheds. They're more sporadic based on apartment complex and all of that. So if you were to have all your sewage from your micro watershed going to the sewage treatment plant that treats the sewage, and then the secondary treated water, there are 3 levels of water: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Secondary treated water is still not potable, gets put through a wetland system, which is not very different from what's happening in Jakur Lake before it then enters the lake. So you are preventing any kind of contaminants to go directly into the lake system. And then also to reserve some land for urban agriculture, pastoralists, and sacred groves, which were part of the ecological system of the lakes and drainage channels. Traditionally, they were always part of the ecological system because that's the land that gets flooded most. And then, the STPs that we are proposing for every micro watershed doesn't have to be this ugly building. They can be beautiful public spaces with public parks, as you see on the example on the right. So they can be actually very important public spaces with an educational component to it. And very quickly, we'll run through the second case study of Ahmedabad to show how different it is, but sort of with the same parameters. So here on the left, you see Bangalore with the lakes and the drainage channels. And on the right is Ahmedabad with a micro topography of 1% slope. So for you to understand what 1% slope is, a sidewalk in, let's say, America has a 2% slope. So a 1% slope is absolutely negligible, but it still is a slope. There is no flat land. The earth, there is no flat land. And so what people did in that micro topography, you see these paths These are generally what we call kacha road or unpaved roads. And all of these paths would drain towards the village Talav, which is identified over here. And all the settlements would be around that village pond. So all the water, when it falls to the ground, eventually drains and gets collected into these ponds. And then these ponds are the ones that are recharging the groundwater aquifers in there that are then used for agriculture. And if you see just one other thing, how equidistant the settlements are. It's absolutely fantastic to think that people came up with this system before there was satellite imagery or surveying. This has been there in the ground for thousands of years. So this knowledge of working with the land, this traditional knowledge, came before we had any kind of sophisticated tools to understand the landscape.
No, I just wanted to say two words. The ponds that each village has, called talas, is where the water converges and where the aquifer is made accessible again in different ways in the season where there's not going to be much water. But often in around and in the middle of this area where water would collect during the monsoon, there are wells that access the aquifer, which through this system has been gradually replenished. So there is a way of managing the floods and recharging the aquifer in order to make water accessible during the areas and the periods that are dry.
And so all of those villages finally connect to drainage channels. What you see over here is one such drainage channel that drains the whole land towards Nal Sarovar. And what you see at the bottom is sort of a Google section of the land. And again, you see it is 1% slope. This is around 40 kilometers length of drainage channel. And people put this system in before any of the heavy engineering infrastructure works to drain all this land towards Nal Sarovar. And the other thing that we know, Nal Sarovar is a Ramsar site, it's a bird sanctuary, and we often find a lot of wildlife along these drainage channels. So they're not just, channels carrying dirt, water. They're actually ecological lifelines for birds. You find a lot of bird activity along these drainage channels.
So when we took on the case of Medabat, which again, we're showing to you to push this idea of watershed, where it is through valleys or through micro watershed, as an essential component of the life of a city. You see, Medabat is, as Sonal said, in a very different topographical and geological condition than Bangalore. Nevertheless, it grew, as you see the maps on the left side, rapidly around the Sabarmati River. And there is a change in scale in the little diagrams on the left. After partition, the city literally exploded mostly towards the west. And you see the map with the city expanding with those radial axes. And you see, most importantly, the very regularly spaced villages within the agricultural land, which are the red dots, with the yellow area, which is what has been so far acknowledged as the area of pertinence and control on the part of the villages. So as the city grows, it literally eats up the land, absorbs the villages, completely upsets the system because of the sort of hard infrastructure that has to be put in place, and eventually seems to be, even in the case of Medabat, create a number of problems. This is maybe too technical. This is a diagram that explains how the city has set up the conversion from agricultural to urban. Essentially, it is called land pooling. The agricultural lands are redrawn essentially on the basis of percentages of attribution of uses. So 60% is left for development, and the 40% of public spaces is divided by between roads and public purpose plots. So now what happens, however, is because in the meantime, the network of connections that fed the villages and the talas through the channels and that were going through the fields collecting the water, because these plants are drawn as grids irrespective of the land topography, you see that the public purpose plots get to be dispersed like sprinkles, here and there without ever becoming an infrastructure of public space. And so it is geared to sort of some level of compensation of public space, but without the effect at the systemic level that would respect the way in which the agricultural land had been set up. And so what happens de facto, as you see in the 6 diagrams on the upper right, I mean, what used to be lakes are not receiving water anymore. They dry out, or they get to be filled with trash. They get to be covered up, and eventually they get to be built over. So that is the way in which the city has grown in Bangalore, and it's happening as well in Mehrabad, in which the whole system and the lake themselves tend to disappear. There used to be more than 600 lakes in Mehrabad. There's a little bit more than 100 left with the growth of the city. Sometimes the city decides to preserve some lakes, but the point is that they become beautiful objects surrounded and in support of the real estate value that would be all around. And because they concretize the perimeter of it, essentially they also kill the ecosystem that used to live in the wetland areas that surrounded the lake because of their variable heights. So there is a control in the amount of water that is there. There is a bounding of it, and there is a sort of a service that gets to be done to the real estate in case it does not get to be wiped out, as it usually happens.
Also, the edges of a lake are where fishes breed. And when you concretize the edges, you've taken away the habitation where fishes breed. So it's killing life in the water also in a different way.
So you're going to see now a little bit of the work that we do at Columbia University in the Graduate School of Architecture and Planning, where we have the chance of teaching what is called design studios. So we took one village as a sample. You see, it is one of those that it's still somehow dotting the agricultural land, but it is already surrounded by a number of infrastructure. Nevertheless, it used to have its own watershed, its own boundary of the village, and the system of ponds and channels that were feeding towards the lake of the village itself. What is called the planning scheme, as you can see, is already expanding towards the village of Godavi. It's already gridding the fields, let alone introducing a university campus, in the context of heavy infrastructure that keep on cutting this network. There is an incredibly complex freight corridor between Delhi and Mumbai that has produced very, very high embankment for trains that carry, double level of containers. There is the branch of the Narmada Canal, which is also a big piece of infrastructure that comes from hundreds of kilometers that used to be done for the feeding of water of the lands, but by now, with the land being urbanized, has a sort of different potential use. And then there is the yellow roads that get to be traced in order to mark as grid the growth of the city. So we have a couple of projects that we want to share with you, maybe to have a sense on how one can find ways to counter, even in this case, which is pretty extreme, the impact of infrastructure or development, and still retain and promote either spaces for non-human inhabitation or networks of connections for public space. Well, I can briefly, in between this incredible embankment that have cut the relationship between the land that they now comprise and all the land on the outside, within this space, there is no more agriculture by definition. there was a drainage channel that you see coming down diagonally through it that can support, again, a sort of an ecological system. So this student project essentially said, why don't we think about a sanctuary for this space for animals? And we provide also an institution like an hospital that bridges both the street and the regional drainage channel and somehow is in support of the sort of possible life for non-humans that can be created within this space.
And the second project we want to share looks at two sites. Site A, which is the intersection of the Narmada Canal coming, and then the drainage channel of the city, and how the student proposed some landscape ideas of what kind of public space can happen. And Site B is an existing pond within the campus and sort of reorganizing the development in support of the pond. So site A here, you have the branch canal of the Narmada Canal coming through, and the drainage channel that drains the water of Ahmedabad towards Nal Sarovar going under it. And there is a linkage between the two. So the student proposed to this whole landscape intervention to convert it into a public space and also maybe an educational space where you can go and understand these two water infrastructures. And the second project, very quickly, this was from the master plan of the campus. You see the pond is retained, but it is lined by hard edges as if it was an object and not in context to its hydrological system. And all the buildings are facing away from it. So the back of the buildings are towards the pond. The student did the reverse. He inverted the buildings towards the pond and sort of freed the pond to connect to its existing drainage channels and the soft edges. So why do we have to have, go in and concretize everything? So to bring back that sort of natural life to the talab, but also to retain these paths, drainage paths that then connect back to eventually Godavari village. And we did have a conversation with AUDA, which is the planning department in Ahmedabad, about these ideas and importance of drainage channel in the hydrological system of the city. And I think they are beginning to have these conversations in the planning circles. And in summary, I think, 4 points. Lack of watershed thinking in lake rejuvenations is absolutely ineffectual. Drainage channels are to lakes what arteries are to the heart. If you kill the arteries, you're going to kill the heart. So they determine the health of the lakes, and they are critical in flood control and aquifer recharge and must be considered as essential infrastructure. And lastly, that this framework can update the conventional approaches to infrastructure as monofunctional assets in urban development. And in the end, I think we can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used to create it. We have to think differently, and we hope that this is one of the ways to think differently. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonal and Sandro. And again, I said, I think we must have learned something new. I always learn something new whenever I have a conversation with Sonal and Sandro. I know there are a lot of technical questions. We don't have much time, but just for provocation's sake, I just want to raise these questions as educators. In our schools, what are we teaching? We are still teaching about water conservation in terms of very superficially. We'll talk about water harvesting system. We'll talk about water is always mixed with sanitation, and then you're like doing hand washing, all sorts of cleanliness things. Are we ever discussing how was our land made, and what are the, as Sonal and Sandro saying, arteries that are there? We don't know the feeder channels that are feeding our lakes. Sometimes we don't even know where the lake is and what is the purpose. We think that it's a sign of beauty and the water comes from the tap, and we just need to be looking at the tap. In rural areas, they are a little bit more connected than the urban areas and the peri-urban areas. So I think we are very, at least from my observation, you guys are all educators. You can correct me if I'm wrong. that what we are teaching our kids are symptoms of the disease. We are not really discussing the disease, and we are not really discussing what caused the disease. And so we are thinking of water conservation, but we are not saying how did we even come to this place where we are just neglecting it and treating water as a resource, but not really water as something that gives life. So all of these aspects, please correct me if I'm wrong, on how we have become so I guess so technical in terms of our treatment of water in the schools, but not really valuing our ancestral ways of planning and ways of, understanding things. Also, this topic of water, I think, is such a nightmare for any educator. I want to call it nightmare because we feel that we need to be in charge of all the answers, but we don't have answers in this situation. The water is owned by different entities, water is managed by different entities, we have different relationships with water, so there is no one answer. So how can we deal with this? How can we now learn from this particular perspective? And I know we don't have much time, maybe taking 15 minutes extra if you have time, and then let's regroup
Sure.
again at some later point to see how we can what we can do with this particular aspect and what we can create together. So anyone wants to take up those aspects or discuss anything that Sonal and Sandhu presented?
Not to answer. Oh, okay, I'll let Aaron go ahead. Aaron, please.
Yeah, one of the things that I just discovered, and this was working with my business school coach that I was assigned in Barcelona, was a complement to the SDGs. It's called the IDGs, and it really it's much more widely accepted in Europe. But really, what it does is it coaches at the corporate and academic and institutional level the skills that we need to be developing as individuals to kind of teach these methods to others. So let me see if I can find the link. But the IDGs are very widely accepted with European companies like KPMG and those things. But we need to be teaching these hard skills and soft skills to the people who are in the world of the SDGs as well. At least that's what I believe.
Yes, yes. No, absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, we know that we are sort of limiting our focus to a certain degree, but in a way, it's the attempt of allowing to think holistically at the scale of the whole system and how it works, even in conditions that apparently are flat. I mean, the agricultural wisdom in Gujarat has created over centuries this topography that allows the water to feed the channels, to feed the villages. So it is something willful that in the case of India, who has relied on the monsoon, so fundamentally, obviously, is made very evident, even in very different conditions like Gujarat and Karnataka.
Yeah, I think Abhilasha, you had your hand raised, and then Shannon and Ashwani.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for such a lovely session, such an informative session. I have a very different aspect of
Maybe
water. Name is saying I'm a school, we are K2 and global school program SDG advocate and mentor. And Radhika, for this session, really informative. My eyes have opened to so many different things and what I would like to bring to my school. Unfortunately, our curriculum till grade 10 is very limiting in terms of what information we provide. And now with the rationalization of the syllabus, I mean, I literally cried when I saw grade 10, grade 6 syllabus for SST. So internally, what we can do in the school, I think this is what I'm taking away from here. and unless and until there's a policy change, there's very little we can do in terms of how it goes in the school. But then the enhancements that we do to the curriculum and what knowledge at age level, age appropriateness of the information, all that, I'll try my level best to provide this to my students in the school. My question to you both is that, the recent floods in Punjab, and then what's happening in the hills. I belong to Uttarakhand, and the devastation that we've seen in this monsoon. Of course, the rain has been unprecedented this year. But then, what message is there for the urban planners, for the government, in this situation where in Delhi, Yamuna is flowing above its danger mark and has started overflowing, and the area near Jamuna are affected, and this is a common man that's get affected. Their houses, the policymakers are all sitting in their homes. So how do we manage that, and what can be done by? We are laymen, and we are grassroots. So what do we do in our capacity that somehow this can be resolved? And what message do we take as activists to the government or to the urban planners, so that this situation can be, at least something can be salvaged with whatever we have around with us. Thank you.
Yeah, we had a similar presentation to the National Institute of Urban Affairs in Delhi, and all of them obviously are dealing currently in real time with floods in Gurgaon and in the NCR of Delhi. And really so unfortunate to see the flooding in Himachal Pradesh. And I believe that a huge reason is serious deforestation there and illegal cutting of trees that is happening. Obviously, when you cut the trees, the soil is not held together. And when you have such a rainfall event, there is excessive soil erosion, almost avalanches of soil. So I think obviously at a policy level, we have to really protect our forests and our land. In terms of Delhi and what can you do at a neighborhood level, people think, and this was a question raised before, and I've been thinking about it. People think Yamuna is flooding, but the water to Yamuna is coming from a higher ground to lower ground, obviously also from higher elevation. And so one of the things I think that we can all do in our neighborhood level is to look at all the soft spaces and see how we can increase the number of impervious spaces. Now, we as citizens are not responsible for roads, but we are responsible for our individual lots, and we can have a lot more impervious spaces. We can also organize, pervious spaces. We can also organize neighborhood parks to have these percolation pits so that the amount of water that's falling in our neighborhood is somehow managed there, and it doesn't add to the urban runoff eventually that might go and join the Yamuna. So I think there are several different interventions that can happen. These are micro interventions, but micro interventions times 1,000 or 10,000 can have a significant effect.
At the level of education, what we have seen with some of the initiatives of the CSR, say of ITC in the peri-urban area of Bangalore, is water harvesting from the roof of schools. Water harvesting and filtering would then convey to the kids the possibility of washing their hands, of having an understanding of the relationship between the rain and the availability of water and how to filter it. And we've heard stories in which these kids actually have gone back to their parents and started to raise the question. I mean, why are we sort of wasting all the water that comes down with the monsoon and discharging it casually, as opposed to beginning to recharge and recycle this water? And that's where it starts, at the very, very basic individual level, and maybe at the level of very, very primary education.
Yeah, and one other thought, and I hope, I don't know, maybe we should reach out to Google. What if in Google Maps they start adding a layer of watershed? And so each one of us knows what is our watershed. What is the watershed of my neighborhood? So we can understand how water, when it falls, will flow. That's going to change hugely people's understanding of their surroundings. Just like, the introduction of Google Maps and satellite imagery on our iPhones changed how we understand our world.
Thank you. I think Ashwini is there. Ashwini? Can you hear us, Ashwini? Oh, I think you're on mute.
I'm working on my phone, sorry. Didn't Shannon have a hand up too?
Yes, just after you.
Okay, all right. So I'll keep it really short. First, really impressed with the detail and the nuance of the work you've done in the case of Bangalore. My name's Ashwini Vasisht. I'm a professor of sustainability in New Jersey in the US. I lived my formative years in Bangalore many, many decades back. So I have an affinity for that city, and I really appreciate that you've looked at it in this particular perspective. You raised the issue of watersheds, and I'm referring to the idea of bioregional planning and watershed planning, and taking a watershed approach to bioregional planning. Two questions that I have for you. One, are there other researchers that are doing similar kinds of work with you or with this approach in India? Would it be useful to bring together two or three teams, like you as one, to talk about that approach to planning in India? You seem to be knowledgeable about Delhi. So, are there other cities that you've looked at with this particular perspective? And is there any way to compile that body of knowledge that you've gained into one place so we can talk about this approach and how it would change planning in the Indian context, urban Indian context? Thank you.
Yes, I think that, what we've noticed in Bangalore through our relationship with many groups, initiatives, and organization is that it seems as if the scale of the crisis in that city is prompting a little bit of a wake-up call in terms of the gathering of information. So the city has recently, very recently, instituted what is called a climate action cell, and they have in fact gathered the contributions of some of these initiatives or some of these groups, some of them focusing more on lakes, some of them focusing more on wells, some of them focusing on drainage channels. So yes, in that particular instance, it seems that the city is acquiring at some level, because then it gets to be very complicated with all the different institutional responsibilities that don't talk to each other. So what this is, the attempt is to introduce a space of conversation by in between people that in fact have already worked for years on these issues. I mean, way ahead of us. I mean, we've been trying to learn from them a little bit, except that we were trying to gather this at the level of the techniques of urban design that inform the way in which plans are drawn.
Yeah, and we are really hoping to have many more conversations with government agencies through the collaboration with people in Bangalore who are already embedded in those networks and relationships, because obviously we don't want this to remain as academic work. It's really focused towards implementation and policy. Currently, we've only studied Delhi because I am from Delhi and familiar with it, and Ahmedabad and Bangalore. But the principles really remain the same, whether it is in Chennai or in Hyderabad or in Calcutta. I think the principles of this watershed understanding remain the same. Here in America, California has done tremendous work around watershed planning. And some of the examples that I stated, for example, they have a tax law. If you have a certain percentage of impervious space within your compound, you get a tax benefit. And so through that, they've been able to reduce their water consumption per capita by 43%, which is quite enormous. They still have a water crisis, but they're consuming much less water today with a bigger population than they did 2 decades ago.
And there is another hand.
Shannon, yeah.
So I'll put my hand down. So just to introduce myself, I run a global network across 46 countries. It started in India, dedicated to sustainability, and I've lived in Bangalore for 10 years. I worked mostly with older students, I would say, like high school and early college. And I bring this up because how do we ground contextualize these efforts? So I asked this question, I think it got buried in the comments, but you know, I really think the concept is really intriguing, but there's also some ground realities that we face in India and including in Bangalore in terms of like the way laws are enforced, ownership of water, you know, all of these things that make it actually quite difficult to create these sort of realities. So how do we balance that? Because at the level of students that I work with, they start to get very, very jaded and disenchanted with the whole process. So I bring this up as you know, asking also for advice from both of you on how we can approach these sort of issues.
Yeah,
given
I
the
think
reality.
you raise a good point about the governance around water, and obviously that is a huge issue. Who owns water? And there are 32 departments within Bangalore that have some kind of stake over water, and then nobody really owns it. But what we have found, actually, if you were to go into the peri-urban area, where some parts of it is agricultural, their water is owned by the village. And it is commonly managed, and it is a commons resource. So not too far from Central City, you have a very different model of water management and ownership that might be a good place for some of your students to go and visit as a counterpoint to what is happening in the city. Right. And I think it's not just the students who've been jaded. Everybody we're talking to is jaded because of this web of governance. But I have to say, because the crisis is so huge, the government is beginning to think differently. So the master plan we shared with you for the first time shows the valley zone as a special green zone. Now, if it gets implemented or not is another issue, but at least that thinking is beginning to seep into those conversations as well. So I don't have a magic bullet answer for you, but I think there are pockets of promise. There really are pockets of promise in every place we look at.
And I think for the future, to look at places where things are still happening as opposed to as already happened, where obviously the situation is very difficult. It's very difficult to imagine to rip off a street and the pipes, and so rethink about that once the density has already happened. But at that transition between rural and urban, the authority and the management of the panchayats, for example, still has the potential of establishing a dialogue at the moment in which the permits for constructions are allowed, even if the plotting has already been authorized, maybe at the level of the district. So to identify these moments of transition is where I would invite to sharpen attention, because it's their future, and it's happening. And while it happens, there's still something that has a sort of a wedge of possibilities.
I just want to bring up that, I mean, because we don't know each other. So I work, for example, with very closely with the Watershed Organization Trust, which you probably know because they actually advocate water stewardship, which is kind of what you're talking about. It's like communal ownership of water systems, which is something that actually has to be decided collectively. It's not like a law or anything like that, but I mean, that is something that we work with. But that becomes really difficult when you get into a high density population. So there really is quite a big difference between studying, for example, water issues in rural India or peri-urban India or urban. They're like, at least to me, they are completely different ecosystems. So I also just to push back a little bit, I find that that it's difficult then for the students to take learnings, because we actually do work with them. You don't have to go far from Bangalore to be in, in farmland. But the some conditions there, the situations there are quite different, right? I mean, that, and also the issues that the communities face in terms of, sanitation issues in rural areas versus urban areas. So I think, I mean, really in urban situations, I think this becomes quite tricky. And I'm just wondering if we can think about programs that maybe train the students also a bit more multidisciplinary in that fashion, so they actually can learn also about some of these laws and policy issues. Because I find that that's also a problem, is that we're so disciplined in terms of how we teach students, especially at higher levels, that they don't have that capacity to think, oh, okay, I have to also think about the law. I also have to think about policy. I also have to think about hydrology. I also have to think about social behavioral change, which are very different fields. So
Are you familiar with the K100 project in Bangalore City?
yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a great example. It's not sufficient. It's not all good. Like everything's not perfect because it's still a concrete tank. But it's a really great example of major initiative. One person cannot do it. It was a multi stakeholder initiative of taking an existing drain and fixing it. But you can do that if you don't understand the system, the hydrological system. And I think for students to understand that is the first step for them to do anything.
And that's a good example, because the integration of what is usually understood as nature versus city, or city versus country or agriculture. In fact, if you start to mix them and you understand that there is no more pure nature and there is not just city that can operate on the basis of a modernist logic of growth, development, and infrastructure in concrete, if you start to understand that those categories shouldn't be in our mind, as simple as that, because it set up this sort of duality, which then is very difficult to intersect and to eventually, like in the K100, start to bring in a certain sensibility right in the middle of the city. Or, as we are saying, where the city has not really happened, make sure that you don't forget the wisdom that you are intersecting with. And it is in that hybrid zone, which I think a great opportunity for education lies.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and also for that kind response.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you, Sonal and Sandro. This is just a starting of a discussion. As you can see, we have millions of questions. We have not even addressed what the chat has, all the questions that are there. But I think it's a starting of us thinking about maps, topography, ancient wisdom. I want to say maybe collective thinking, watershed, citizen science, so many aspects that we need to be looking at, and also not to be afraid of not having any answers, because if we have multidisciplinary approaches, no one person has all the ideas of multidisciplinary ways of thinking. So getting hold of, and the best part is that there are all these community members who have all these expertise in your own community. So I think it is somehow at least a starting of how we need to be thinking about waterways, and how we just not need to be so dejected that we can't do anything, but at least starting to think about ways that we need to reform, education, the way it is practiced, education for sustainable development and climate education. But I mean, again, as maybe we'll call you later on after we've gotten together on how we need to be doing things differently, and maybe create some sort of resources and then get your feedback at a later stage.
I just want to say one thing, Radhika. This is fantastic. This is totally great. And the number of questions in the chat are very, very, very interesting and provocative. So I think that just to continue this conversation, we will, so to speak, print them out and eventually attempt to address more specifically some of those questions, because the outcome of this session, I think, is very promising, is very beautiful. So
Yeah.
thank you, Radhika, and thank you all for participating.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for being here.
Mhm.
Bye.
Good luck, folks. Well done.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.